Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining me. How are you all this afternoon? Nice to see you. I am going to paste in the chat a link to the slides that I'll be referencing throughout the class. And if you would like me to email these to you, you can just put your email in the chat. I'm happy to email it. I believe that Kim will be posting them on the Torah in Motion website as well. You can also message me your email if you don't want to post it to everybody in the chat. So with that, we'll just wait one more minute and we'll get started to give the stragglers a chance to join. Can you just confirm with me you see a screen that says Yeshayahu's roadmap?
Yes.
Perfect.
We do.
That's great. All right. I think I'll get started then. Not too much of a pause. Okay. Great. So those of you who joined last time, you know that I introduced this notion that there are different tools for how we can study the Haftarot of the Shiva Dinachamta. We'll refer back to those three tools or those three lenses throughout the class today, but one of the most famous tools or lenses is the idea that the Shiva Dinachamta are meant to be a conversation between God, the Navi, and Bnei Israel, developing across the different Haftarot, beginning with Shabbos Nachamu, when, in a sense, God turns to the prophet and says, "Go, Nachamu, comfort my people." And then the people's response that we saw last week in Ekev, where they're basically saying, "No, we're not ready to be comforted." And continuing this week, as we'll see in just a bit. And we introduced this idea that viewing the Shiva Dinachamta as a conversation, in a sense, really creates this space for Bnei Israel's feelings of abandonment and their anger at God that he put them through this exile. It allows for those deep, dark feelings not to be brushed aside and brushed away with, Pollyanna-ish remarks of comfort, but it gives space for those feelings to be processed, to be able to transform into a much deeper commitment, to then be able to really stand before God on Rosh Hashanah and say, "Yes, God, we proclaim you as our King." And with that sense of conversation, we basically said one really interesting tool for how to study the Haftarot of the Shiva Dinachamta is by looking at how it relates to the previous week and the subsequent week. What role does it play in this conversation? And that's really how I'd like to introduce the Haftarah for this week for Parshat Re'eh, that we once again begin with Hashem. Here we go. We once again begin with this sense of we're mid-conversation. Hashem has been addressing the people, and the people's response last week was, "We're not ready for that comfort. We're not able to be comforted." And now in the opening for this week's Haftarah, once again, we have space being made for the feelings of abandonment, for the anger to be articulated. And that's how we open. Aniyah sa'ara lo nechama. You're an unhappy, storm-tossed one, you're uncomforted. And so you see the nachamu, right? That word of, right, lo nechama. No, we're still not comforted. And it's a very clever framing that throughout the Shiva Dinachamta, we're meant, in the opening words, we're meant to kind of recall back that opening haftarah, nachamu, nachamu. So that's really interesting how it really is a conversation. It really is, these haftarot really are connected to each other. And a really I think, really clever and fascinating thing that pops up once you kind of see how these haftarot are framed is the opening metaphor in the beginning of this week's haftarah. So after this opening phrase, saying you're this storm-tossed one, the metaphor of a boat that's just relentlessly in a storm and has no smooth sailing. We then switch the metaphor a bit to basically say a boat which is perpetually unmoored, which is perpetually at sea, is then going to be the very opposite, is going to become Hine anochi marbitz bapuch avanayach. No, you're not just going to have anchor, you're going to have a foundation, you're going to have building stones. And not only that, visadatich basapirim, your foundations will be of precious metals, of sapphires. So this metaphor of this tossing boat that can't find any rest, can't find any comfort, I'm going to remove that situation, and I'm going to bring you to shore and really build you up. And then we pick up with this metaphor that we've established over last week and was also established during the Haftarah for Shabbat Nachamu, with this relationship using quite feminine imagery between Hashem and Bnei Israel. So I just want to pull up the Haftarah that we read from last Shabbat, for Eka from Yeshayahu Perek Mem Daled 49. Because in last week, if you remember, there was a lot of feminine imagery, but the metaphor, precisely what the relationship was between God and Bnei Israel, kind of changed. And as I see it, I think there were 3 different expressions of this feminine imagery. So the first was God as mother. The next was basically Israel, Knesset Yisrael as mother, mourning her children. And then the third imagery, the third metaphor used in the Haftarah for Parshat Ekev was Israel as wife and God as husband. And that was kind of like the third and final metaphor of last week's Haftarah. And I pulled up those verses on the screen to remind you of that where the Haftarah kind of ended was basically God turning to the people saying, Eze sefer kritut imchem, did I divorce you? Like, we were married, and now you're saying, Bnei Israel are articulating, God, you've abandoned us. And God's response to that is, well, I don't see any bill of divorce. I don't see any get, we're not divorced. In other words, our relationship is still ongoing. And then now, turn back to the opening of this week's Haftarah. And it's so fascinating because we're jumping forward 5 chapters in Yeshayahu, but as a Haftarah, it's kind of an ongoing conversation. So look at the opening metaphor in the Haftarah for this week. V'samti kadkod, this Hebrew is hard. Shim shotayich u'sha'arayich la'avnei ektach v'chol gvulech la'avnei chefetz. I'll make your battlements of rubies, your gates of precious stones, the whole encircling wall of gems. V'chol banayich limudei Hashem v'rav shlom banayich. Quite a famous verse that we'll address in a bit. And your children shall be disciples of God, and great shall be the happiness or peace or welfare of your children. And the metaphor here seems to pick up with that, basically saying God is like a suitor. God is the boyfriend. God is the young husband, basically saying, I'm going to adorn you with precious gems. And here, the imagery from the previous verse of a building continues, and it clarifies and solidifies here that the precious gems, the necklaces and the bracelets that God is giving to Israel, the wife, Israel, the girlfriend, Israel, the fiance, is basically the new walls of the city. And this is this theme of the newly rebuilt walls of Yerushalayim being expressed through precious gems and being expressed through this notion of God giving it to us, God building it, is really a theme that continues throughout this section of Yeshayahu. So I'll just pause for a second and kind of talk about this section of Yeshayahu as a reminder also from last class, because I think this is a really foundational concept for learning and really understanding the Shiva de Nechemta As you see on the screen, the book of Yeshayahu really divides up into 3 sections. And all of the haftarot from the Shiva Nechemta are from the 2nd and the 3rd section, which really talk about Israel rebuilding their relationship with God in the wake of Babylonian exile. What does it mean after experiencing total abandonment and punishment from God to then go back and rebuild? And how is God going to repair, and how are we going to repair? And this specific haftarah is from really the end of section 2, where we're starting to transition to section 3 of Yeshayahu, where it stops being, in a sense, vague calls to return and repent. And it's the prophet starts speaking with much more specificity about, here's what your rebuilt city is going to look like. Here's what your rebuilt city is going to be. And so this image of, I'm going to give you a necklace, and that necklace is the city walls. It's part of a progression of imagery that we're getting to that leads us into the 3rd section of Yeshayahu, where we're starting to talk more and more specifically about the city being rebuilt. And the prophet envisioning to the people, here is the future that we can imagine for ourselves, a future not just of us returning from Babylonian exile, but a future where we're rebuilding Jerusalem. And of course, the city walls are such a, I think, a key image for when we think about the fast days that we dedicate to mourning the breach of the city walls and the destruction of the city walls. The promising of the reversal of the city walls being rebuilt, and not just that, God rebuilding it for us, is really such a powerful metaphor of reversal. It's such a powerful expression of comfort. So I just put on the screen examples from earlier, much, much earlier in the book of Yeshayahu, where the prophet, a generation earlier, was describing what it would be like when the city walls would be destroyed. And in a sense, the city walls were personified. Her gates shall lament and mourn. In other words, and she shall be emptied, shall sit on the ground. This is such a wild image of the gates, the city walls of the city themselves are almost like personified as a person who can mourn the missing people. You're almost meant to imagine that as the people are exiled from the city, the gates themselves are mourning the loss of the people. And that as the walls kind of crumble down, it's as if you're meant to imagine, the broken, torn down walls. It's like they're sitting Shiva because they're missing the inhabitants, they're missing the people. And again, in Perek Yudaled in chapter 14, Halili Sha'ar Za'akei, where the prophet turns to Halili is this language of like mourn, cry out. The prophet turns and addresses not people, but walls once again and says, hey, walls, you mourn, you cry for the people. Again, the walls are personified as mourning people. And now then to have in this section, and not just in this section, in other verses as well, I'll pull up some other examples where the rebuilt walls are really the real, I think, powerful emphasis of, wow, your reversal, your total reversal from utter mourning to renewal is really coming true. This idea, I think, to see how Yeshayahu in this section, in this 2nd section of the book, is paralleling earlier sections, is really, really key also. And I think I'll just remind you of a tool we had raised last week as well for studying the Shiva Nechemta, which is noticing the fact that all of the Shiva Nechemta are from the book of Yeshayahu. Is basically, it's almost like the rabbis in choosing these haftarot from Yeshayahu to be the haftarot we read throughout these weeks. It's almost like they're forcing us to have a crash course in the book of Yeshayahu. I don't know about you, but I spent 15 years teaching Tanakh in various different Jewish day schools. I taught high school Tanakh, and I did everything I could to avoid teaching Yeshayahu or to avoid teaching, Nevi'im Achronim. I was like, whatever I can do to kind of skip past it, it's too hard. And it's only, I think, more recently where I've come to appreciate these books and really not just appreciate it. I'll describe it an unhealthy level of obsession with Haftarot and these books and these chapters. But I think in choosing these as Haftarot, we're forced to then go back and basically study it. And what you see when you kind of realize, wow, Yeshayahu is describing a reversal of the earlier sections. I'll just throw this out here. It's basically forcing us to see Yeshayahu as kind of like a holistic book. So this is also something I referenced last week, and I'll pull up the outline of Yeshayahu once more on the screen. As I said last week, I think many people are familiar with the concept that secular Bible scholars will suggest there's multiple authors of Yeshayahu. And even, Rashi will suggest maybe his students, found his scrolls and added on later sections. And that's why there are different time periods within the book. But I think what's clear is that even though the book of Yeshayahu spans multiple time periods, there's a holistic sense to the book. It is one book in the sense that in the second half of Yeshayahu and in third, Yeshayahu is talking to the curses and the horrible descriptions of the evil and the destruction that will come to you as a punishment and reversing it. And all of that's a very long-winded way of saying, in describing in our Haftarah how Hashem is going to rebuild the city walls, Yeshayahu is reversing earlier dire predictions from earlier parts of the book. Okay. I want to also, I think, bring in another lens, another angle about why these city walls are so key and how it, I think, opens up a window into this time period of Shivat Zion, this time period of rebuilding the Second Temple. Because the way that Yeshayahu describes the rebuilding of the city walls really stands in contrast to other books in Tanakh, and I'll explain what I mean. So Yeshayahu basically describes God is the one who is going to be rebuilding the city walls, and it's going to be effortless on your part. It's like handing somebody a present of a box of jewelry, right? A gift. You'll open up the box, poof, there are your city walls. That's how the city walls are going to be rebuilt. And the truth is, we have a book in Tanakh that describes what it was like to rebuild the city walls of the Second Temple, and it was anything but effortless. The entire plot of the book of Nehemiah, really Ezra Nehemiah, it's really one book, is all about building the city walls. So I excerpted for you, and you can see this on the screen, the entire plot of Nehemiah, who is this courtier in the Persian government. The book opens where he's basically in Persia, in Shushan, and he hears a report from a Judean who was in Jerusalem during the time period where they've already built the temple, but the city itself is still in ruins. And he hears a report, they come back and they say, guess what, Nehemiah? Jerusalem's walls full of breaches, its gates are totally destroyed. And he hears that, he's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they rebuilt the temple, but they still don't have any city walls. He sits, he weeps, he's mourning, he's fasting, he's praying. The whole book of Nehemiah, the plot is basically, will Nehemiah rebuild the city walls? And so I'm seeing here, and I'm almost imagining Yeshayahu, perhaps during this time period, right? His messages are being shared. These messages we just read in the Haftarah of, hey guys, God is going to rebuild your city walls. And then you have in the book of Nehemiah a different perspective, a different way of narrating this time period, basically saying, we need to rebuild these city walls, and imagining how these messages both shed light on what it might have been like to have been alive during this time period, and what strength and conviction the people might have needed to really believe that the rebuilding process, even though it really demanded real human effort on their part, that they needed to be able to see, in a sense, the prophetic hand of God, almost like the prophet can lift the veil and say, you see, the fact that the Persian emperor, the Persian king, allowed Nehemiah to go forth and gave him permission to go on this mission and rebuild Jerusalem, don't you guys see? That's God handing you a precious gem. That's God handing you a gift of a necklace of sapphires, saying, go and rebuild the city walls. And in fact, the entire book of Nehemiah is just about his conviction in basically inviting the Judeans who have made the very perilous journey from captivity after Cyrus has allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. He surveys the city walls and he attempts to rebuild. And ultimately, the book ends with he is successful. So I'm imagining how this ability to hear Yeshayahu's words during the beginning time of the Second Temple era and really believe this is what gave people like Nehemiah the conviction to then go forth and do it and actually rebuild it. Moving on to the next verse, the prophet basically says that if you manage to have these gates of precious stones, Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13, here's what's going to happen. Your children will be disciples of God. They're going to be very learned, and they'll be so happy or peaceful. Shalom in this context, I think this is the Sefaria GPS translation. It means here it's translated as happiness. I think perhaps welfare might be a better translation, but it's basically saying everyone's going to be so happy. Isn't it going to be great? I want to point out there's a really interesting pun going on here in Tanakh. Puns are used sometimes, but you have to kind of see it in the original Hebrew. So there are a few words that are connected here. So the word for child in Hebrew is banim or ben. And the word for builder is boneh, livnot. And there's a third meaning that this verb can have. Anybody want to suggest a third meaning that the bet nun can have?
Bina, to understand.
Yes, bina, knowledge. So just look at how in this verse, in a sense, and in the surrounding verses, all of those words are coming together, and it's a play on those sounds. And then in the previous verse, it's not quite the same word, but it's playing up with that alliteration. Let's see if anybody can spot a fourth word that once you hear those sounds of the bet nun, you start hearing that fourth word come up. So look at Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12.
Has it been between?
It could be. That wasn't the one I had in mind, but that's an interesting idea to incorporate the preposition. So perhaps a fourth and a fifth one. There's one more.
Avanim, avnei.
Avanim, stones, yes. So look at how so cleverly, I remember, trying, middle school girl, wrote my diary entries, tried to write poetry. And I was always like, well, English can rhyme. What's poetry in Hebrew? This is poetry in Hebrew, where you have such clever usages of the same sounds in the same word, in a sense, used with multiple meanings, that the stones, the walls will somehow encourage children. The children are the builders. The children will be knowledgeable. And all of this, of course, comes together, I think, when you read it in context. There's a very famous Gemara that is actually the ending of Masechet Brachot, where I'm sure you're familiar with this, that Rabbi Hanina says, Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. Torah scholars increase peace in the world. Shene'emar, as it says, V'chol banayich limudei Hashem v'rav shlom banayich. And then he quotes our verse. And then he says, Al tikre banayich, don't read the verse that says children, ela bonayich, builder. builders. In other words, that children who are knowledgeable are the ones who will then bring peace for their generation. And when you just look at this Gemara, like, just face value, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, right? Wow, the rabbis really forgot to read Tanakh because the verse says Banayef, it doesn't say Bonayef. And furthermore, like what is their connection between Torah scholars and peace? Like there's no natural connection between them. So like, what is that connection? So then I think the what's really clever though about Rabbi Hanina's teaching is that he's clearly looking at this verse in the context and reading the whole verse in the context, and he's seeing, oh, this is a verse that's part of a larger section about building the city walls. And it's a verse that's about when you have city walls, you're going to have a sense of solidity, of permanence. And with permanence comes a chance for peace. And not only that, look at the next verse, which I think Rabbi Hanina is reading very, very clearly. Having city walls isn't just, okay, you'll have protection from outside forces, which is great. What having city walls means is you have a city that can be established, b'tzedakah tikonani. You're going to be established through righteousness. And I think throughout Tanakh, the image of sitting at the gate always represents a sense of justice being promoted. This idea of the judges of the town are found at the gates to the city. And this idea of within Eicha and the Kinot, how we say, that Zion is meant to be the city of righteousness. It's meant to be this almost like haven of faithfulness to God. That's the image of a city. And without city walls, in a sense, we're saying you're unmoored. But having city walls is meant to represent justice. So I think Rabbi Hanina is basically cleverly kind of reading these verses and putting it all together and saying, oh, it's going to be these children who are limudei Hashem, who are knowledgeable, who are going to use their binah and use this kind of establishment of the city walls, the Even, to then promote this sense of justice in the city. So it's quite a clever reading, I think, of these verses. This idea of what a rebuilt Jerusalem is meant to represent, I think brings us to the third tool that I introduced last week as well. And that is that when we read the Shiva de Nechemta, we aren't just meant to read them in conversation with the previous week and the next week and read them as like a conversation between God and the prophet and the people. And we're not just meant to read it and look at, oh, what's the broader context within Yeshayahu, and how is this reversing earlier parts of dire warnings from earlier parts of Yeshayahu, and why are these sections from the book of Yeshayahu chosen on other sections? But I think we're also meant to read it quite intentionally alongside Sefer Dvarim. And I introduced last week this notion that Dvarim is the book of the covenant, and the rupture that we've experienced, where throughout Dvarim, Moshe basically says, if you don't follow in God's covenant, He will exile you. Well, Yeshayahu in these sections is speaking to a generation who have experienced that. They have been exiled. Their temple has been destroyed. And Yeshayahu is almost like, okay, let's pick up the pieces. How do we rebuild? How do we repair? And we, after Tisha B'Av, have experienced that as well. Reading Sefer Dvarim is the most painful thing. How do we repair? After all of those, warnings that Moshe basically said, it came true. We had Tisha B'Av a few weeks ago. How do we repair? How do we rebuild? So each haftarah, I believe, is chosen to very thoughtfully connect to the parsha. And I think that is definitely the case for for this week's haftarah as well. So I want to kind of now think about how the image of everything Yerushalayim is meant to represent and how this section of Yeshayahu, which is really talking about we're going to rebuild the city, and here's what the rebuilt city is going to represent. It's going to be from God. It's going to be a chance to reestablish the city in a sense of righteousness, not just safe from oppression, not just safe from ruin, but it's going to be a city of righteousness. That's really a central theme in this week's Parsha. Just to kind of prove this point of how, I'll leave that point aside for now, but let's take a look now at some of the examples within Re'eh, because once you kind of have in your mind, oh, the Haftarah is about a reestablishment of the city as one key theme, when you look at Parshat Re'eh, it starts jumping out at you, really, this notion of, wow, this city is meant to represent so much. This city is really key. So I'm going to put some verses from Parshat Re'eh up on the slide, up on the screen. Okay, so here is from Perek Yud Bet, from chapter 12, towards the beginning. When you get to Israel, here's what you got to do. You have to tear down the idol, the Canaanites who have been living in the land of Canaan in Israel. You got to tear down their altar, smash their pillars, all of their avodah zarah. You have to just destroy all of that. Really, you just have to ibadatem et shmam min hamakom hahu. You have to get rid of that. And remember, don't worship God like that. That's not how we worship God. We don't make graven images. We don't make images like that. Rather, ki im el hamakom asher yivchar Hashem Elokechem mikol shiftechem lasum et shmo sham l'shechno tidushu ba shama. Rather, look to the site that God will choose from among the different tribes. Yerushalayim is not listed here, but God's going to choose a place. And that's where you're going to go to bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your maaser, all of that. That's where you're going to go. And then again, just a few verses later, okay, you're going to cross the Jordan and you're going to get some peace. Hashem's going to help you defeat your enemies. All those burnt offerings, all those maaser, that's where you're going to bring it, to the place that God will choose to establish his divine name. And then a few verses later, hey, watch out. You're going to want to bring sacrifices. You're going to want to bring your olot, your burnt offerings. Don't just bring your burnt offerings anywhere. Hey, be very careful. Ki im b'makom asher yivchar Hashem. Just, you're only going to bring it in that one place. And then again, a few verses later, there's going to be maaser, certain types of maaser that you're only going to get to partake in it in b'makom asher yivchar Hashem. And a few verses later, let's say you have the urge to eat meat, but this is the kind of original shechita kind of establishment. You can eat meat, but usually your assumption is that you're going to be eating meat as part of a korban when you go to hamakom asher yivchar Hashem. But if you're not able to make that journey and you still have a hankering for meat, here's how you're going to do it, but you're not going to have any blood. The verses go on to continue. So it keeps on going. So what I'm pointing out is that you start noticing that in Parshat Re'eh, over and over and over again, this place, Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, is emphasized over and over and over again. This phrase is emphasized, intentionally worked in, even where, from a literary perspective, it's redundant, right? It could have just said, hey, there's going to be a place that God's going to choose, and that's where you'll do, and then list all of the things. But the Torah intentionally, in a very repetitive way, keeps on repeating this. And I'll tell you something else. Isn't it odd that no city is mentioned? It would have been less laborious to just say, hey, there's going to be a city. It's going to be called Yerushalayim, right? It's going to be, that's where, it's going to be your capital city. And, that's where you're going to go to do all these things. I'm reminded here of I'm trying to think, what's the book by Henry James? Oh, maybe some of you know it. Which is the book by Henry James where the woman marries the very, very, very wealthy man? She doesn't. He's a very wealthy suitor, but instead she runs away with this kind of like evil older man. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Is that Portrait of a Lady?
Yes, Portrait of a Lady. Yes. Okay. So Portrait of a Lady, there's one line that always has stuck out with me since I read it in college, that Henry James did something so brilliant. When it gets to the part where he's, describing how wealthy this suitor is, he doesn't put a number to it. He just says, and he described his wealth in a number that was so shocking and so over the top that everybody was like, wow, this guy's super wealthy. In other words, sometimes you can achieve more by not sharing specifics. What Henry James did in not giving a specific number to how wealthy the suitor is ensuring that readers like me reading it, hundreds of years after the novel was written, are still floored and impressed by how much money it is. Versus when I read Pride and Prejudice and read about Mr. Darcy's 10,000 a year, I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like enough to really, sweep Elizabeth off her feet. And in a way, like, this is what's going on here, where by purposefully not saying the name of the city, every time we're talking about this place, we're being reminded, oh, this is God's choice. This is not your city. This is God's city. And that's the theme that the Haftarah is expressing. God will give you the city walls. You don't get it. You're going to build it. Yeah, Nehemiah talks about that, but that the people are going to partake in building the city, but it's really God giving it to you. God's going to build your city walls with the sapirim, with these kind of divine sapphires. And you see this expressed as well in how and in what this city is meant to represent, in how Re'eh, towards the end of the parsha, talks about the Chagim. So I put on the slide, on the screen, the description of Lo tuchal lizboach et haPesach be'echad she'arecha asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach. You can't do the Pesach sacrifice in your own home. You can only do it in the place where God will choose. So at first glance, you're just like, wow, this is another example of this very long list of things you can only do in this city. But what you start realizing when you get to this section is enforcing people to go back to Yerushalayim, the Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem, right, the place that God chose to do the Pesach offering. The city, in a sense, becomes this like repository of collective memory. This city becomes not just a city, but it becomes a memorial. And it's so interesting because, when we visit Yerushalayim today, I think we have this sense that, oh, the city is like a memorial, right? You see ruins, it feels ancient and modern at the same time. It's very easy to feel like the city has a history, but it was always meant to be that way. You were always meant to go to Yerushalayim and, in a sense, have this sense of, this is God's city. This is the city where I'm meant to remember my history. This is the city where I'm going to come to it at designated times through the year. And I'm going to remember, as the first verse on the screen says, Pasuk Aleph from chapter 16 of Deuteronomy of Devarim, offer a Passover sacrifice to your God in the month of Aviv at night, that your God freed you from Egypt. In a sense, the city is meant to be where you're going to come and remember your national history. So it's not, the temple isn't really referred to here. It's the city that's this like holding place for all of our memories. And in a sense, what we're doing in throughout the Pesach story, and by linking the Shalosh Regalim, which all in their own ways are linked to the Pesach story, and linking it to the city, the Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem, and all of these rules in Re'eh that are forcing you to go back to the city, we're basically forcing you that you're not just going to forget the Exodus. You're not just going to forget your history. You're always going to have to remember it. It's woven into your core identity. And the idea that God enslaved you and God took you out, every time you go back to Yerushalayim, you're meant to remember that idea. You're meant to remember God, and you're meant to remember that piece in your history. It's inescapable. And that idea, I think, is being expressed as well in Yeshayahu in the next section as we continue in the Haftarah. Because after the prophet describes isn't it going to be so wonderful with these rebuilt city walls? You're going to have a city, as verse 14, Pasuk Gadal describes, tzedakah, it's going to have righteousness, and it's also just quite practically going to free you from oppression. Your enemies won't be able to reach you because you'll have walls. The very next verse, however, describes and acknowledges what the people might be feeling, which is, wait a second, God, it's so nice that you're promising I'm going to offer you protection. I'm going to rebuild your city walls. But wait a second, God, you're the one who did this in the first place, right? And that's the same challenge of the Exodus story, which is, it's so nice to sit down on Pesach and be like, thank you, God, for saving us from Egypt. But wait a second, if you were powerful enough to save us from Egypt and to free us from slavery, then that means you're the one who put us there in the first place. And the Exodus story then is really a story where we're opening this really big, like deep philosophical can of worms that we don't really address, which is, hey, God, you did this to us, and we're kind of celebrating that. We're not really solving that. This is the issue of theodicy, right? This is the issue of, God, how do we reconcile the fact that everything is from you? You are so powerful, and yet things happen in the world that we can't understand and that don't seem fair. So take a look at Pasuk Tetvav, verse 15. Hingoyer go efes me'oti migar itach alayach yipol. Surely no harm can be done without my consent. Whoever would harm you shall fall because of you. In the Hebrew, I really think you see a hint to the Exodus story in a word that repeats, a word that's punned throughout in the Hebrew, which is the word ger.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who said that, but yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind, right? The whole Exodus story in our national consciousness is about, you were strangers in a strange land, and then you should be kind to the Gerim. You should be kind and open because you know what it's like to be Gerim. You were Gerim. That is your national identity. And now that word is almost like being punned, right? I talked about, this is poetry in a sense. Here in this verse, basically saying, yeah, I am the one who is all powerful. If I say nobody's going to harm you, like if I built these divine walls, you better believe it. Nobody's going to harm you. But that promise itself of like recalling the Exodus of, hey, remember, I saved you from that, I could save you again from this, leads into the next verse, which is almost like God defiantly saying, Anochi barati charash nofeach be'esh pechem umotzi kli lema'asehu v'anochi barati mashchit echabel. I created the smith to fan the charcoal fire and produce the tools for each purpose. I create the instruments of havoc. So that's not a very comforting verse, because it's God basically saying, oh, I can bring you comfort. I can build you magical city walls that are going to protect you. But God basically saying, it was me also who made those tools that harmed you. That was me too. I created the instruments of havoc. I create the instruments of comfort. This is quite an interesting acknowledgement that I think is also in a way really like painful to kind of acknowledge, right? When we talk about theodicy in Tanakh and the question of, how does God allow evil to happen? I think most of us jump to the book of Eov, the book of Job, and think about, okay, Job is about that. And yes, it is all about that. And as, Job's friends, Eov's friends come and they basically pay him Shiva calls, they do the worst possible job because they basically try to convince Eov that he must have sinned, right? Because if God is letting you suffer, surely, Eov, you must have sinned, so you must be evil. That is one book of theodicy in Tanakh. But truthfully, there are many more books in Tanakh that deal with theodicy related to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. So just think about how in analyzing this horrific cataclysmic event in Jewish history, how different books in Tanakh have different lenses through which we can understand, God, how could you do this? So for example, think about the books of Melachim and Yirmiyahu. Each of these books basically explains the issue of, hey, God, how could you do this? And explains how it was schar va'onash. It was reward and punishment. It was deserved. So in the book of Kings and the book of Melachim, it kind of, I think, hints to the fact that the kings themselves gradually became corrupted, and maybe kings distract you from the King of Kings. Maybe kings distract you from God. And the book of Yirmiyahu, I think, analyzes this issue of, well, how could God allow this to happen to you? Your own sins, people, right? Your own idol worship, your own betrayal of God. But what about afterwards, right? So you weren't the generation who sinned. You're the generation who experienced Babylonian captivity. You're the generation who experienced the utter abandonment. And you're now wondering, okay, so God, maybe we sinned, but what about the Babylonians? What about the Persians who are oppressing us? They're evil. Why do they deserve to oppress us? And I think this issue is something that other books in Tanakh deal with. For example, the book of Habakkuk, I'll pull a few verses up on the slide. This, I think, is Habakkuk's from Chayasar. This is his cry to God. Shall I shout out violence and you not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you look upon wrong, right? God, how do you allow this injustice to go on? And Habakkuk doesn't really have a historical context, but I think he is talking about the issue of the fact that the Babylonians, who are themselves so evil, are succeeding in oppressing. So Habakkuk is basically saying, okay, God, maybe we, the Jews, sinned, but how do you allow the Babylonians to be successful when they are even worse than us? And he identifies the Chaldeans. Lo, I'm raising up a Chaldeans, that fierce, impetuous nation. They are terrible, they're dreadful. The Chaldeans the Kasdim is another term throughout Tanakh for the Babylonians. So in a sense, Habakkuk acknowledges this issue of theodicy. And the answer in Habakkuk is not, well, the Babylonians are good people, that's why God allows them to succeed. The answer in Habakkuk is basically just wait. You have to wait. There is yet a prophecy, ki od chazon lamoed, v'yafech laketz, v'lo yechazev im itzmadmea, hakelo ki vo yavo lo yeacher. You have to wait. And you can almost hear the echoes of Hakelo b'chol yom she'avo from the Ani Mamins, from this verse. In other words, wait, it's going to come, Habakkuk, right? Sometimes we're in a hurry. The answer to theodicy of how God can cause evil in the world, and how is it that the Babylonians, who are so evil, how is it that they are succeeding? God's answer to Habakkuk is, you just have to wait a little bit. Yeshayahu here in this haftarah is raising this issue. In this haftarah, we are acknowledging this issue of God is openly saying, I caused this, right? I caused you to suffer. I'm going to rebuild, and I'm going to be the source of your comfort and the source of the rebuilding. But yeah, I created the tools of destruction. In this haftarah, there is no, at least I don't think, any specific answer. There's a call to be comforted. There's a call to come close to God, but there is no, I think, answer to this question. But I do want to, I think, kind of show you, because I think studying these haftarah within the book of Yeshayahu is so important, that I think in the very next few verses in Yeshayahu, right after this haftarah, you do see a bit of an acknowledgement of this issue. And that's in the verses that are the haftarah that we read on fast days. So I'm sorry, I'm jumping around on the slides. It's hard to know how to organize it. But if you go on to the very next chapter, to Yeshayahu 56, these are from the verses that we always read on fast days on the afternoon. And these verses are quite famous. I'm sure you all you'll recognize them instantly when you hear some phrases read out loud. But these are just a few verses after the verses we just read, where Yeshayahu basically has God openly saying, I caused this all. I caused you to suffer. Yes, I'm promising you to rebuild, but I was the one who orchestrated your suffering. But just a few verses later, the prophet says as follows: V'al yomar ben hanechar hanilva el Hashem lemor, havdel yavdilini Hashem me'alamo, v'al yomar asaris hen ani etz yavish. Yeshayahu is trying to convince the people, come back, come rebuild, come close to God. Don't say, I'm done. Me and God are done. I am a eunuch. I'm a saris. I don't know if he literally means somebody who's castrated, but that's the sense of that word, right? I'm a saris. I'm somebody who has no future. I cannot have children, right? What greater sign is there of the vitality than somebody's confidence and optimism for the future than having a child? And yet a saris is the total opposite of that. But I have no future. I'm a saris. Don't say I'm a withered tree, right? Don't you dare say you have no future, right? Your response to suffering could be, me and God are done. There's no future for Am Yisrael. There's no future to being God's people. And in the next verse, the prophet continues, this is what we're going to say to you. Ki ko amar Hashem l'sarisim asher yishmeru et shabtotai. Follow my Shabbat. B'charush b'asher chafatzti. Machzikim b'vriti. No. Keep my Shabbat. Keep my covenant. And what am I going to give you? V'natati lahem b'veiti u'b'vchomotai. I'm going to give you in my house and in my walls, those city walls we were just describing, Yad Vashem. Literally a monument and a name. Tov mibanim u'mibanot. Even better than sons or daughters, Shem Olam Aten Lo Asher Lo Yikaret, that will never be destroyed. The answer to the evil and that has happened in Yeshayahu isn't just wait. It's a bit of a different answer. The answer is God is promising you a legacy. And that's a really interesting way of kind of not brushing aside the suffering and not saying, oh, Gamzula Tova, or there's a hidden plan. If this is happening to you, it must be good because God is only good, right? Those are saccharine messages of comfort that don't really address and don't really acknowledge the very real suffering and raw pain that a person might be experiencing. But what Yeshayahu is doing is basically saying, only God can promise you a monument and a name and ensure that your suffering and your place in the Mesorah is not forgotten. To me, this is almost like a divine yibum. Throughout Tanakh, yibum is this idea of ensuring by marrying the woman whose husband is dead by a relative or a brother, marrying the woman, and by bringing a child who will be named in the name of the deceased. That is the biggest chesed in Tanakh, this notion that you can ensure that someone's name is not forgotten. In Tanakh, that is in a sense a real chesed shel emet, a real kindness. And God now, in promising people Yad Vashem, this is Yeshayahu, I think this is his response to how do we comfort people who have suffered so much? How do we deal with the fact that this is the reality? So again, there's no real answer of this is what God's plan was. We're never going to get that. But this is, I think, a comfort in a sense of in the city walls that God is giving you, the city walls themselves are going to be, right? The chomot, the walls are going to be themselves the monument to this people that will never be destroyed. I'll just say parenthetically, I think there is in Yeshayahu another possible answer to this issue. I'll just stop sharing for a second. In Yeshayahu, it's really interesting. I think there's another hint to an answer, which is that the suffering itself is in a sense redemptive. And those chapters, of course, are the chapters about the suffering servant, which have numerous Christological references. And I think quite intentionally, we do not read those chapters as part of the Haftarot for Shiva Nakamta. I've been discussing this with a scholar of Second Temple literature, and these chapters, which are obviously the basis for lots of Jewish Christian polemics about who the identity of the suffering servant is, and who are we talking about? Are we talking about, obviously Christians identify this in one way, and obviously there are various different Jewish responses, but one of, I think, the most accepted Jewish responses that just makes sense with the pshat of the psukim is that we're talking about Knesset Yisrael, that we're talking about this notion of Israel's suffering is not for naught. Israel's suffering will have meant something. Israel's suffering in some way is a kapara for something. That is another answer within Yeshayahu to theodicy, but we do not read those chapters as part of Haftarot. I think quite intentionally, we basically say those are not chapters we're reading out loud. We're not going to give any opening, in a sense, to people to kind of misinterpret what might be something that we regard as chat. We're not going to give any opening to that. We're not going to give any credit to anyone aside from God. So where we're basically closing the Haftarah for Re'eh is by emphasizing there's this master plan, yet God is emphasizing no external evil forces to blame. And the Judeans, you're not just victims of whatever there's, the prevailing political current. This is all God's plan. And God's omnipotence demands acknowledgement. And so the Haftarah quite fittingly ends with this promise of there's going to be an everlasting covenant. There's going to be this sense of promise for a future. And there's going to be a rebuilding of Beit David. There's going to be a rebuilding of that legacy. I'll pull those verses back up on the screen so we can read those together. But basically, the Haftarah is not kind of trying to shy away from any of these troubling issues. Quite the contrary, the Haftarah is quite openly saying, this is all from God. And yet, if you look at Pasuk Pasuk Gimel, Echrata lachem brit olam chazdei David hane'amanim. And on that basis, it's almost like the prophet is turning to the people and saying, we can make a brit, an everlasting covenant, based on this. Can you join me in this brit? Can you join me in this space? And as this is a conversation that goes on week to week, we'll have to join together again next week to see, is Israel going to accept this suggestion of this covenant on these basis, that God is not pretending, I did not cause this. God is saying, I did cause this. Can you still accept comfort based on this? I'll stick around a few more minutes for questions or comments if anybody has any. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share.
Superb. Thank you. Yasher Koach. Just beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Same question that we have today. If God will, or the enemies will, but lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Rosie. I think that was you.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I appreciate how you blend in your English background, your background in literature.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to see you as well. Can I
Great to
give
see
you
you.
a shout out if that's okay? Mrs. Wiedeker is one of my former high school teachers, and I really love
Really
to see
great
you.
to be here with your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.